But the sandstone itself is no guarantee that oil is trapped inside.
It's been a good day. All the dynamite shot like it's supposed to. Had good swings, swinging the jugs and boxes. I have about 4.5 miles today. And what I enjoy doing is being able to see at the end of the month our production, looking at the plots of what we've shot, trying to determine if it is a good area. You catalog it in your mind so whenever you come back to an area, you know you're going to have good data. Here we're looking at station number, get the number of files, pull out your recorded tape, write down the box number, 332, station number, again, 2249, and there are 28 tapes, 28 files on tape. This is line 48. That is recorded tape. Put in a blank tape. That clears your file count. Shut her up. Put her back in. Plug in your power cord for charging overnight. Say goodnight. There's the last three. Your final clear is 2174. You'll have a pull list for me in the morning? Okay. It looks good down about 8 seconds so far. Is it? Yeah. How's you going? Yeah. Fair. You good? I'm going to go drink one. We'll see you. All right. Shot off the coast of Brazil, going into Belém. Stayed down there about 1.5 years. There's a lot of stress and strain in this business, but I think that's what keeps most of us going. The divorce rate's pretty high in this business. I was lucky. I met my wife while I was doodle bugging. She's followed me all over the world. She maintains a home. I think that's what's kept us together in Houston. And the 2 children have been in school and they're fairly stable. They don't call me Uncle Daddy anymore because I do get home occasionally. 2152, here it comes.
What we're looking for with our sophisticated geophysics is, shall we say, the Empire State Building lying on its side under about 2 miles of a jumble of different kinds of rocks and different layers of earth above, and with a irregular surface on top of the earth, and all of which combine to produce a great deal of confusion on our data.
Without the geophysicist's knowledge of sound, without their mastery of its capacities and limitations, the majority of our greatest oil fields would remain undiscovered, and the world would have run out of gas at the pump years ago. What happens to sound, to a signal, especially a weak signal, when it travels a long way? Let's let the classic RKO film Citizen Kane help explain one of the problems of dreadful sound. To improve the sound, one might wish to record the opera singer from several spots. This to help eliminate noise and false echo. For much the same reason that the geophysicist wants to listen from different locations to seismic waves returning from a possible oil reservoir rock. It was that need to produce a clearer seismic record or picture of the subsurface which set Harry Mayne and others in search of a solution. Harry Mayne revolutionized the science of finding oil with a technique he named CMP, the Common Midpoint Method. or as it is often called today, CDP,
No, I never
the
did.
common
Really,
depth
really
point.
didn't expect that to be there. For many years, we did seismic work with only a single source and receiver position, so that each representation of an echo from a point on the subsurface or a reflection was only a single representation of that point. In the early 50s, I devised a new method whereby I used a series of pairs of sources and receivers, with all of which had a common midpoint, so that all of the echoes which were received from these different pairs were different positions or had a different aspect, look at the subsurface. So I said, well, if I look at this thing from several different aspects, I might be able to keep the noise from duplicating. So by moving the source and the receiver in opposite directions about a common midpoint, I hope to get the noise to cancel itself out and get the reflections from this common midpoint to reinforce each other. Now, what we attempt to do is to follow a given formation within the Earth. This entire traverse may represent something like 5 or 6 miles.
What we're trying to do with our geophysical work is to learn how the Earth is built, how it is structured, how the various layers are laid one on top of the other, and how the various types of deformations occur in the Earth. Here's a chart that shows some of the different kinds of traps that we find. The simplest and most obvious of these traps is an anticline. The anticline is basically a hill in the Earth, capped with rock through which the fluids cannot flow. Stratigraphic traps, of which onlap is one example, or trap pinch out against an unconformity, are very common. This type of trap, the great East Texas oil field, is of this type of accumulation. We can see some of those over here on this other section here. For example, right in the area, right in through here, we have, you can see this layer of rock, of earth coming on through here, pinching out against this other layer coming on down through here to produce a trap of that type right there. And there are other places on here also where we can see similar types of oil traps. We have rocks that were formerly continuous and then have been broken along some plane and brought up into an offset position like this. And then the oil that might be present in the porous rock over here flows on up till it hits that fault plane and it cannot flow anymore, so it is trapped up there. And many of the world's biggest oil fields are of that type also. That's a very common type of trap. That's, in fact, probably the most common type of trap that we run into in our business.
The search for oil is a vast scientific and human puzzle that must be solved anew every time. A puzzle involving an intensive and costly effort and luck. A puzzle that is as different in Alberta, Canada, as it is in Saudi Arabia, as dissimilar in Kansas as it is in Egypt.
The vibroseis is one of the newer energy sources for seismic exploration. And instead of using a strict sudden pulse such as it might be generated by a dynamite blast, it generates a long, continuous wave vibration. Dynamite is still unchallenged for those applications where we cannot get the heavier machinery involved. It would sink out of the sight in soft marsh and swamp terrains.
Vibrators operate around the world, gently forcing salvos of sound waves into the earth, gathering data in amounts up to 10 million bits per second, and using more magnetic tape than any industry in the world. On land in parts of the United States and Europe, the cost of a seismic survey runs from $1,500 to $25,000 a mile. But the world sometimes has to pay a lot more than that for its dependence on oil.
The fundamental reason, of course, up here was the fact that we really believed that this was a basin that would generate huge amounts of oil. We had all the elements for the trapping features, and we could tap a tremendous amount of oil into features the size of what we were looking at up here. Of course, at that time, we didn't know that Prudhoe Bay was up here. We didn't know that this thing could exist, especially with the magnitude of the structure that was eventually found.
Right. Well, this is the probably one of the most critical maps ever made of Prudhoe Bay. It was made by Pete Clara with Richfield.
Yeah.
And I believe, if I'm not right, Harry, this was the map that Richfield based their bidding on the state lease sale in 1966, which determined the eventual ownership of Prudhoe Bay.
That's right. The industry had 10 dry holes in a row up in this part of the world. We just finished drilling the Susie, 60 miles south. Union had drilled the Cookpuck over to the west. And here we were about to spend another approximately $5 million, which in those days was a fortune, even to an oil company, to drill another test. And the risk of drilling this well was probably something in the order of 1 in 1,000. We were the last company left to explore on the North Slope. Sinclair and BP had moved out. Union had drilled their dry hole. And when we drilled the Prudhoe Bay State number 1, I'll never forget flying up there in the winter when it was dark and there wasn't another light to be seen until we spotted the rig lights up there at Prudhoe. Most of the companies had essentially the same kind of data. They'd acquired it in the same time frame. The interpretations, as we found out later at least, were basically the same. And the difference was, I guess, our aggressiveness and the conviction that we had a reasonable course to follow, and we were going to follow it to the end. And we hadn't finished by drilling the Susie well. We had to go north. We had to drill Prudhoe Bay, and we had bought the leases, taken a jump on the competition by having acquired a bigger lease position than anybody else. So really, the drilling at Prudhoe Bay was the culmination of all the ideas that had been building from 10 years before when we made our first entry up here with a field party in 1959. A lot of people have said that we were very lucky to find Prudhoe Bay, and I have disputed that for a long number of years because, as is true, we mounted a very solid, sound scientific effort up here with all the latest technology that we could apply, including the best seismic, and we afforded ourselves the opportunity for success to occur here. So we had some serendipity, but we weren't just downright lucky in this thing.
In 1937, Sidney Kaufman, then a party chief for a Shell seismic crew assigned to map a structure in South Texas, directed a daring and unorthodox field operation. Without the knowledge or approval of his superiors, he carried out the first seismic reflection survey of the sea floor on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. 4 miles in length, instrumented with a single geophone for each of 8 channels, surveyed by shore-based transit, and shot by sinking cases of dynamite. That marine seismic survey ushered in a new era of exploration offshore and vastly increased the role of the geophysicist because geophysical techniques alone provide the ability to see beneath the ocean.
In the early days in the southern North Sea, some of the work was through the minefields of the Second World War. That was tricky. The war was important in the development of geophysics, in instrumentation, in positioning, navigation systems in particular. But I suppose the most important feature was in the men. Men were available who knew how to live rough, who could even enjoy it, and who could get the job done. The North Sea was a very satisfying place for a geophysicist to work. The Earth responded and gave up her secrets. Almost any good idea you had, you'd try it, and the results would improve. Take reverberation. Now you let off a bang in the water, and the bang rattles up and down between the sea surface and the sea floor, and the sound goes and all the echoes coming back, they all go so the sound becomes jumbled and confused.
It's the same effect in a church. Why do you think church music is traditionally slow and long drawn out? What was the reason for the ancient plainsong chants and the slow intoned responses? Same problem, reverberation. Sound rattles back and forth between the hard, bare walls of the church, and the sound becomes all jumbled and confused. You can hear the reverberation. So, if you want to hear the message clearly, you need to remove the effect of that reverberation. If someone were irreverent enough to sing a Gilbert and Sullivan patter song in a cathedral, you would not be able to make out the words. And the early seismic results from the North Sea, they were just as garbled. But the geophysicist found the solution. He was able to remove the reverberation and see the deep rock layers below.
Much as sound filters remove static from a radio broadcast, computers can filter unwanted echoes and noise from seismic data.
Aberdeen, Scotland. A port. A country rebuilt by science.
Hoist the signals.
The world's geophysical navy consists of 134 vessels. One of its flagships on duty these days in the North Sea. And the Cecil H. Green, now searching the Gulf of Mexico. One of the largest and most advanced seismic ships afloat, the Green costs $500,000 a month to maintain.
Western wind, Cecil H. Green.
In these ships, with these men, we can trace the future of oil and gas exploration. More than 5 out of every 10 barrels will be found offshore. It looks deep beneath the ocean floor as if it had eyes. It has, in fact, the most discriminating ears in the world. Its thousands of hydrophones inside a streamer cable respond to reflected seismic waves generated by air guns blasting the seabed and the rock formations below with wave upon wave of sound. As it happens on land, the echoes are picked up by the hydrophones.
Okay, we'll go 2 times there.
The data are translated into electrical digital signals and recorded on magnetic tape. As much as 10 million bits a second, as many as several hundred boxes of tape. Facts, all of them. Facts about the subsurface. Facts to reveal nature's best-kept secret.
Our job, like I said before, is to, first, the safety of the vessel, and then secondly, the safety of all the people on board. Now, third, our primary job is to serve the seismic interest on there, because, after all, that's the only reason we're out here for, is for them. when they begin their operation back there, we have to go down a straight line. So we have this machine here. It is the output of a computer down there that tells exactly where we are within feet. And it gets its information from 2 different survey systems ashore that transmit out to us. And a system on board that transmits to these shore stations, as well as satellite navigation mixed in. It all goes into the computer, and the best average answer of it all comes out on this machine, and we attempt to steer exactly down that line. We have to do it up here with this automatic pilot by adjusting it. Later on, if what we find on our seismic information is interesting to the oil company, they will probably send us or another crew out here to do more detailed work. And if that detailed work proves interesting, they'll send a drill out here at great expense and drill for oil. So if our information is wrong where we are, and they drill in the wrong place, they're liable to miss the oil pool, because oil is just not everywhere underneath of us. It's quite an elusive thing, and you can miss it by 100 feet, you've missed it.
The recording room, immaculate, cool to a constant 68 degrees. Its personnel responsible for recording seismic, gravity, and magnetic data. Like any combat vessel in hostile waters, the day is 24 hours long. 13 men on 12-hour shifts for as many as 60 days at a time. But for half the crew, half the time, the war is over. Geophysics has come a long way.
You couldn't begin to find oil today with those antique methods that we had before. That kind of oil has all been found. The easy oil has been found. Just like in the earliest days in Saudi Arabia, you didn't need geophysics at all. All you had to do was go out there and do some very nice surface geology and map your structures, which were reflected, those structures which were reflected on the surface. And I well remember the original exploration manager of Aramco, chief geologist. He had no use for reflection seismology. He thought it was just a lot of black box stuff, because he could find all the oil that they could possibly drill for just on the basis of surface expressions of these subsurface formations. But he eventually came around to it when they ran out of these surface expressions, and then they had to depend upon reflection seismology, which in a sense provided the eyesight for the geologist.
I have a cross-section here that was taken in the South Atlantic. This line represents a slice through the bottom of the South Atlantic Ocean, starting about 30 miles east of the Falkland Islands and going up to just about the eastern side of the Falklands, in order to handle the vast volumes of data that come in from the field. We have to use many of the world's largest computers, all working at full speed, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. These large machines can do 20 to 30 to 35 jobs all at once. They can operate on data from different areas at the same time and do billions of computations per second. If the only machines that were available to us were standard commercial computers, all the computers in the world would not suffice to carry us through a day's work.
From around the world, data are collected and channeled to centers for processing, refinement, and interpretation. While most exploration data are collected and processed by contract geophysical firms, oil companies usually interpret the data and decide whether to drill. Whatever they've spent so far, 1, 2, 10 million, now they must decide whether the prospect is a good risk or a poor one. If they elect to drill, they will be committing millions more. And they will decide on the strength of these pictures, which may be, should be, are oil-bearing structures. Gravity, magnetic, and seismic data are combined to produce contour maps. Thus, billions of bits of information are translated and transposed into a small gallery, the final output of one of the world's most scientifically demanding pursuits.
I'm showing part of the three-dimensional data set in the Prudhoe Bay area. And on this data set, after I adjust a few of the colors, we can see all of the trapping mechanisms that they were looking for in Prudhoe Bay. One of the trapping mechanisms was the Lower Cretaceous unconformity, which is now being displayed. You can see the unconformity meandering across the surface of the cube, shown by the arrow. Along the south face, it dips to the east. This Lower Cretaceous unconformity is a discontinuity. It's an erosional surface that cut across the main reservoir rocks. The discontinuity is around 100 to 130 million years old.
The geologist knows rocks and their properties, the history of the Earth, the formation of its layers. The geologist determines whether conditions through geologic time might have produced a potential oil or gas habitat. The geophysicist, superbly qualified, is part physicist, part geologist, mathematician, and computer expert. More and more, it is teamwork between the geologist and the geophysicist which provides the data and the interpretation for the drilling decision. The heat is on them, and the risk is enormous. Yet the future of their company, and maybe the price of gasoline at the pump, or plastics, or perfume, or another 1,000 products that come from oil, may depend on their decision to drill or not to drill. In the great search for oil, interpretation is the end of the line.
The Willow Island prospect, which we will review today, is located about 100 miles west of New Orleans in southern Louisiana. It's what we call the Salt Marsh area. It's an area that Exxon has explored in the past, and we've had some success. That does not necessarily mean that we're going to drill a lot of successful wildcats.
Fred, today we're here to discuss the possible drilling of our Willow Island prospect. As you remember,
any well that's drilled has a high risk of being dry, and it's extremely important that we look at every geophysical and geological aspect of a prospect before we decide whether or not it should be drilled.
Some of the dramatic thinning from down off structure on the structure, which is indicative that the structure was growing during the deposition of these sediments, which makes it, puts it in good favor for hydrocarbon maturation and migration. So let me try to summarize.
Before you move on, Tim, I realize you've got growth here, but when that happens, isn't there also a possibility that these sands may not be present as you're coming up on the higher part of the structure?
With the thinning, you're going to lose some sand, but I think when Mark talks about the sand story, you'll see that there's going to be plenty of reservoir sand available.
Okay.
So, in essence, from this section, I've showed you that we've got good control on the fault, we've got growth on the fault, and we've got thinning onto our structure. If I could, I'd like to show you one more seismic line.
Okay.
To demonstrate some of these same features.
We're talking about a well that will cost at least $10 million to drill and complete. When you're talking about that kind of money, you have to be sure that you have checked all the possible data in order to lower the risk as much as possible in finding oil and gas.
What I'd like to do now is to show you a type log for our Willow Island prospect. This will be the Exxon number 1, and it's located in this field area about 4 miles to the east. Porosities are upwards of 20%. Water saturations are in the neighborhood of 20%. And the permeabilities for this depth of about 14,500 feet are very good to allow these substantial flow rates.
When Tim and Mark reviewed this area for me, they talked about the large reserve here, which is quite good. They did not mention this smaller field here up to the north. I asked them, is it possible that our prospect could be the same size as this field? If that's the kind of reserve we're looking for, it would be very marginal as to whether or not we could make money on it. I felt like that they had either overlooked this or did not want to bring it to my attention. Okay, now there's one thing that both of y'all have avoided at this point. You talked about this large field over here, which has substantial reserves. I notice this field here has much smaller reserves. Now, if we have the same type of reserves here that we have here, my question is, can we afford to drill this test?
Fred, this field to the north is smaller only because the sands are much thinner to the north. From our regional studies of the sand patterns, it appears that the southern part of the map is much more sand prone than the northern part, and that's why we have a little rattier production to the north. We don't think that that's as much a risk as I'm getting a feeling that you think it might be. We think we'll be in an environment much closer to the field right here.
Okay, Kathy, let's take a look at our land situation.
Red, the buyout line is this outline here in yellow, the wider outline. And we have been trying to buy this leases in this prospect for nearly 10 years. It took us 10 years to put the prospect together. Red, I would not want to have us delay the drilling of this well. I feel we would really have a difficult time renewing that lease. The lessor under that lease is a little old man, about 75 years old, and he lives about 10 miles from here, up to the north. Now, you remember I mentioned it took us nearly 10 years to put this prospect together. Well, the first 5 years we spent just trying to get the little old man to let us set foot on his property. Then when we were able to talk to him, we found out he didn't like to sign any papers. He took us a long time to get him to sign. In fact, the lease broker ended up having to spend nearly every night for about 6 months playing blackjack with him just to get him to sign the lease. So you want to keep that in mind, and I really don't feel like we could probably get a renewal from this man.
Oil and gas are increasingly difficult to find, and it takes more manpower to find less and less oil and gas, and that's with the use of computers. One element that is extremely important is creativity. A geophysicist and a geologist need to be creative in their work. You can take the same person or the same data with two different people, and the person that's creative will find you more oil and gas prospects than the person that is not creative.
So difficult is a search that less than one exploratory well in every 6 which are drilled finds any oil or gas. An even smaller number finds enough to be economically productive.
There's a beautiful anticline out in the northern part of Western Australia. Shows up on the surface of the Earth and shows up very nicely in the seismic work. When the company first went out to explore there in the early 1950s, they drilled a hole right on top of the anticline, and the very first well hit oil. Unfortunately, that was the last oil we found in the area because we drilled a whole bunch of other holes all around it, one only a couple hundred feet away. And what we discovered was that instead of having a whole anticline full of oil, we only had a little pimple on top of the anticline full of oil. An example that we thought initially was a great success turned out to be a dismal failure and cost us many millions of dollars. I spent a long time out in Western Australia working in the very early 1960s, and during that time drilled a number of wells which failed. We invested
tremendous amount of money in the area. Eventually, we succeeded. The company tolerated my failure. In fact, we expect failure because it's not wrong, it's not a sin to fail. The only thing that is unforgivable is to give up on the proposition and have someone else come in and find oil where you gave up. The vision of success has to exceed the risk of failure.
Pete's map really didn't change even with the drilling of several wells in the Prudhoe Bay field. However, the quality of the data we had in those days was nowhere near like what we get today, but the interpretation held up, and it's held up the 20 years since, as a matter of fact.
This is a north-south line through the seismic data set. South is off on the left-hand side of the screen. North is on the right-hand side. The original seismic data that they interpreted to find the Prudhoe Bay field was single-fold analog recorded seismic data. They had lines that were spaced 15 miles apart, tried to interpret those lines and then project into the Prudhoe Bay area what they thought the structure was. What we have today is a full three-dimensional data set. That is, we have lines that are spaced within, say, 50 feet of each other, and trace spacings in the lines that are 50 feet, so that we can get an actual three-dimensional image of the structure. The kind of interpretation that they did back then involved a tremendous amount of art and imagination in order to come up with the kind of structure that they actually came up with. In this 3D data set, we are actually presented with the structure in the data itself. We're looking down on seismic data at a depth of about 7,500 or 8,000 feet in the Prudhoe Bay area. The computer is in the process of putting 16 horizontal slices of the seismic data on the terminal screen at the same time. These slices follow one another in depth, so that if we look at the top slice and then move down looking at each slice after that, we'll essentially be gradually looking deeper and deeper into the earth. Now we're back to the starting time, or the starting depth. We can move through them more quickly to get something that looks more like a movie view of the image. And then it loops through these 16 and then circles around and starts back up at the top. That's why it seems to jump back after a time.
The orange horizon was corrupted, the orange file. So you're going to have to go back in and unload each of the vintages separately with a different shot point interval for each vintage data.
What we're doing here is entering the map-making portion of the interpretation process. And so the first step of that is to input the interpreted seismic data into the intergraph system. So to do this, we use our mouse as we input fault, breaks, as well as the interpreted horizon here in case the orange. And you'll notice up on the right-hand screen, as I'm working, the horizon is being drawn, or the event. We've all worked on this in great detail for 2 years. At this point, this is the end of the interpretation. All the work by the geologists and geophysicists on the interpretation team has ended. The technical analysis can proceed no further. We're essentially at the point where it is up to management to decide now whether or not to drill this prospect. This prospect the interpretation team and the geologists feel very strongly about, and it's up to us to attempt to convince management that this is indeed a good place to spend their money.
Yeah, I think we've covered most of the concerns that I have with this prospect. I certainly think the new seismic was a big help, because I believe it did clearly show evidence that we do have the fault present. I think there's some risk on the sand, but from a land standpoint, I feel that it's either now or never. We're in a good area. We've got some good production around here, and I think that we ought to drill it.
Putting that kind of a picture together is, of course, what we're trained for, and we spend years learning how to do it, and it becomes the solution is maybe not as important to us as the process, and that's strange for other people to understand. I think we enjoy putting all these pieces together and getting them to fit into something that we see grow over a period of time, so that when the solution comes, it's almost anticlimactic. Of course, the big solution is drilling that eventual hole in the ground and seeing if we put all the pieces together correctly. But it's a fascinating thing, and it has its scary aspects at times, but it's really a fun thing to do. And this was the most fun I ever had in exploration, no question about it.
As geophysicists interpret the seismic sections, we see deep into the geologic past. Then, in our mind's eye, we see, perhaps, a delta.
You see the lush vegetation, the dank humidity, and the great prehistoric animals roaming, crashing their way through the undergrowth, fighting. And perhaps we see in that delta the habitat of oil. Perhaps we say, yes, this is a prospect. Drill here. And they drill, and from 3 miles down in the earth, they bring up a piece of rock which has not seen the light of day for 100 million years. And there, in that rock, is the footprint of a dinosaur.
All the easy oil has been discovered. What's left is a limited supply, exceedingly hard to find. What's left, under the best conditions, using the most advanced scientific methods, may still never be found. What's left is not a pool of oil a couple of 100 feet down that somebody sticks a giant soda straw into. What's left is tucked away in hidden traps deep within the earth, cleverly disguised by nature's geologic handiwork in an endless maze of subtleties. That's where tomorrow's energy is hidden.